Yes. Well, sometimes I speak with a script, but today I'm not doing so. And some of the reason for that is because I was none too sure who you all were before I came here, and I'm still none too sure. So, so we'll see how this works out. But it means that I have a kind of sense of an open brief, and there's quite a lot of things that I could talk about. And so on this occasion, I'm fairly open to being interrupted and questioned and going off on tangents and this and that. So I don't mind taking questions as we go through, that's right. And I hope to talk a bit about my own experience and where I'm up to. And in some ways that is a reflection on some of the other keynote speeches that have been given. Because it does seem to me that there is a sort of theme running through here of how many of us, and probably it's true for people who haven't given talks as well, are coping with, dealing with, processing the kind of enormously rich wealth of inputs that we're all open to these days, with Eastern material and Western material and so on. And also the kind of sense, which I think has, in completely different ways, run through several of the presentations, and will run through mine, and probably in a completely different way again, this sort of sense of a journey, as it were, which has an element of going out and return in terms of the traditions that we've grown up with. So that I'm an English person who has been immersed in Eastern, particularly Buddhist, practice, literature, experience, communities throughout my adult life, but I'm still an English person. And during that time, unlike Rob, for instance, who presented earlier, who's had a sort of a much greater consistency, in a way, within one tradition. My first exposure to Buddhism occurred in Cambridge when I was about 20, when, because it was Cambridge, and because at that time there was a great fashion for meditation and so on. The Beatles had just discovered the Maharishi, and there was a terrific sort of buzz about all this sort of thing. And it was Cambridge, so anybody who came to the country and got an invitation from Cambridge, they came. So it was sort of Chogyam Trungpa on Saturdays and Nai Boonman on Tuesdays and somebody from the Buddhist Society on Thursday. And we were sort of exposed to this tremendous smorgasbord of world-famous Buddhist teachers, which was rather delightful, you know. And in due course, I did settle somewhat for about 15 years on studying Zen. But again, I mean, that was interesting in this respect because I studied it with Kenneth Roshi, who really, I'm sure, would have been an Anglican minister if they'd let women in those days. But they didn't. And so she'd gone off to Japan and become a Zen master instead. And so there were sort of elements in the way that she taught Zen which were rather, which you wouldn't have found in Kyoto, you know. But now I do regularly go to Kyoto, and when I go to Kyoto, I find that the Buddhism that Japanese practice is strikingly different from what you read when you read about Japanese Buddhism in a Western Buddhist book. So I can also, apart from my own experience, but somewhat from my own experience, I can talk about the Pure Land tradition of Buddhism, which is somewhat different, which is what I've gravitated to since Kenneth Roshi died in the mid-1990s. So now I practice a form of Buddhism called Pure Land, which is, and you referred to it at the end of your very generously and graciously, I might add. You gave it some good press. David Fontana did at the end of his talk. And it is different. I mean, it's not what most Western people think of as Buddhism. I can come back to that in due course. Then there's sort of, where have I got up to? Well, all of this, in an hour is a bit tall order. But as I say, whatever is your interest, we can go with. But I thought I might sort of start by reading you a poem, which in some ways is one of my poems. And it might encompass a little bit where I'm at, and I can then refer to that. So here is a poem. Love does not fly heavenward. Heaven comes to us. It impales itself upon my bones and yours, and stands to be stoned to death by trade, yet re-arises with an open hand. For love never renounces life, even when cut down by a sword, even slain. Love rises only as high as beings stand, for love sees the world and is not blind, the only one, for it sees futurely. Love sustains. Lovers live prayer and ecstasy in this hard paradise in making, where all shall be well. A lover loves the sea, which he is not. A lover loves the land, which she is not. Lovers love the sky, which they are not. Lovers love each other, whom they are not. And lovers love those who know little of love, for love loves beyond itself and rejoices. Love never annihilates this world, but sups upon it, dining in exquisite pain, seeing it and seeing it gone again, is, will be, and was, holding each specifically in a gentle hand and dying momently from all upon what is to be. So this is a poem, and I hope little by little it'll sort of come together how this is significant for me. In John Rowan's workshop, I spoke a little about certain, you might say, spiritual experiences that occurred in my life, including a near-death experience, and experiences that I had during my period in the Zen monastery, in the Zen monastic tradition. But in many ways, all of this rather more started for me with experiences, I would say religious experiences, when I was a child. You might prefer to call them spiritual or transpersonal or non-dual or something like that. But to me, religious seems a much more apt term, and that's another matter that we could possibly return to. I'm a little bit nervous with this talk, I have to say, because I mean, that's interesting in itself, isn't it? 40 years of Buddhism, and I'm thoroughly nervous. Buddhists are supposed to be all calm and put all that behind them. But in some ways that sort of says it all, because I do feel that the journey that I have participated in anyway, it brings one back to that confrontation with one's raw nature, which is not all ironed out and is not all perfected and is not all smooth. And whilst we can map out many higher states and so on, I can't really claim them with any stability at all. So But one does have moments of elation. One has special moments of experience that, and in a way, I mean, all I would claim for what makes something a religious experience or a spiritual experience or a transpersonal experience, in many ways, all that you can say about that is that it's something that's indelible and changes you. No, I mean, the measure is, do you come out of it changed, and is it something that you'll never forget? Well, when I was a child, my parents removed to Cyprus when I was quite small. So I spent half of my early life in Cyprus. And it was a relatively lonely existence. There weren't many other English-speaking children. So I spent quite a lot of time on my own. And really, I suppose, looking back on it, I can say I taught myself to meditate. Because I spent much time contemplating, well, masterly childish questions like, who am I? And what am I doing here? And particularly, like, what is it to be me and not to be that stone down there? And why do I stop here? And why can't I feel from the inside what it's like to be the stone? And that sort of question, which later I would have started to call koans during my Zen stuff. But, at that stage I hadn't even heard of Buddhism. We were a sort of... My mother was a bit Christian, my father was atheistic. There was a Sufi teke down the road, but you weren't allowed in. Buddhism was off my map. But I suppose one of the things that I want to convey, which perhaps is sort of content or useful for this, is that when I reflect on those experiences, I have to say that what was most compelling and forceful about them, and they certainly changed me drastically, I'd have to say that the powerful thing about them was their sense of being experiences of separation. I mean, often in the literature, one reads about unity and oneness, and they weren't about oneness. They were about separation. They were about, this is me, and that's a stone. And I shall never know what it's like to be that stone. I'll never know what it's like to be you. I might meet you, but I'll never know you from the inside. There's always that uncrossable, there's a limit. And it's because, I would say, of that difference, that separation, that we can love, and also that we can hate. And all this great possibilities that we call life are. They are because of that, you see. And so there is something here that's very important about the not being able to know. When I reflect on it like that, my universe is full of dark matter. 90% of what you are, 99% of what you are, a mystery to me. And even if I live with somebody for a decade, even if I love them deeply, there's still a mystery to me. You see? And it's the fact that there is that irreducibility of the separation that in some ways seems to me to give life its dignity, its possibility, its variety, its meaning, its richness. Anyway, something like that. This is a quote from Iris Murdoch. Quite like Iris Murdoch. The great artist, she's been talking about art and mediocre art and greater art and so on. The great artist sees his objects And this is true whether they are sad, absurd, repulsive, or even evil, in the light of justice and mercy. That's interesting in itself, in the light of. I mean, we were discussing art recently with a friend. He showed me some artwork that was done during the First World War, which shows figures of people in gas masks and the trenches and so on. And in one sense, you could say the subject matter is horrific. But the painting is done with all of the... it's a beautiful painting if you ignore your associations with gas masks and all that. The form is done... There's an attempt to put beauty into it. So I'm very interested in the relationship between love and beauty and pathos and loss and all of that. The great artist sees his objects, and this is true whether they are sad, absurd, repulsive, or even evil, in the light of justice and mercy. The direction of attention is outward, away from self, which reduces all the false unity toward the great surprising variety of the world, and the ability so to direct attention is love. So what she's saying is that love is that ability to direct your attention towards something else. You see? To make that thing become special. Okay? And to see it in a certain light. And in fact, for it to become a light. Yes? That when you love something deeply, then you see other things in that light.
That love comes from deep within you, doesn't it? So it's that love within you is reflected out onto the other.
I wouldn't see it that way. I wouldn't see it that way.
If it's not within you, how can you reflect it out?
Well, I mean, we perhaps could talk about this all the way through. But in a way, you've hit upon something that's quite crucial to my whole way of seeing things now. And I'm not quite sure how to get into it with this discussion, but I would like to. But the sense of it all has to come from within you is not something I share. And I don't think on that map.
Is this transcendence and immanence?
It may be a map that works for many people in this room, I don't know. It's not a map that works for me. I don't think in terms of it comes from within. And I don't, my feel about the whole of spirituality is of that kind. Spirit is not from within. Spirit is what is outside the self. It is an other power. You see? And it illumines our existence. It's not of our making. And so the sense of our own frailty, fragility, we're like corks on an ocean to a large degree. But we can live with a quality. We can live in that light, which is essentially love. But to me, the love is not something that particularly comes from within. I wouldn't think that way. I know many people do, but it's my hour, so... We might do, yes, but it might come out more with other people's questions and ideas.
I had the privilege of talking to you briefly earlier. You seem to be celebrating, emphasising difference, not necessarily separation in the sense of lack of unity, but uniqueness or uniquenesses. Would you like to say a little more on that? Because when we had the conversation, you were generous enough to point out to me that the conventional Buddhist view as held by non-adherents like me had to do much more with unity than with separation.
You see, in the Buddha's, the first two talks that the Buddha gave, the first one was the one about the Four Noble Truths, about which I've written a book, again questioning whether the scholarly interpretation is right. The second one was the one in which he established this repeating phrase, "Thou art not that. That is not you, that is not yours, that is not yourself," as a kind of basic reflection for Buddhists to think in terms of. So I don't think the sense of separation is at all alien to the Buddha, even though the Buddhist tradition has, in many instances, become very associated with ideas of oneness. I'm very doubtful if that goes back to Shakyamuni in my reading of the text. There's a question at the back.
I don't really agree with you with your point about you'll never know another person. Because I'm amazed at how much people know about me that I don't know about myself. I'm often, I look at things like, when you say, "Mark, you're this, you're that," I can't inform myself like that. So we don't see ourselves, we have a view of ourselves.
No, I'm not saying that.
I'm not disagreeing with Tal, I'm just saying
Yeah.
I think it's more than you're giving the impression, even if I'm wrong, that you can never know someone else. But I think you can, and more than they sometimes know themselves. There's elements you can see in other people, but I'll never see.
Oh, you can see elements, you can see bits and pieces, but you never more than see the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I know.
You see, but that seems to me to be crucially important. That you don't see most of the iceberg,
Yeah, I agree with that.
and that's a crucially important thing about our existence, about how we are. When we talk about knowing ourselves and things, usually the implication is knowing our ultimacy, our pristine nature, our primordial mind, our oneness with everything. If we know ourselves, we know how limited, how shitty we are, how fallible, how inconstant, how even our love always brings disappointment. That's how we are. That's our nature, isn't it? De facto. And we can talk as much as we like about elevated states. But I'm very I've met some of the greatest spiritual masters in the world. I don't think I've met anybody, whatever the books say, who has stabilized such states of perfection. It isn't the case. It's not human nature. You see. So it does seem to me that virtues like compassion, say, I don't really like the word compassion, to be honest. I much prefer the term fellow feeling. Because the thing is, really, we're all in the same boat. It's not that somebody achieves some elevated spiritual state and then from this great height is able to reach down to some poor soul drowning in the ocean. It's that we're all swimming together. We're all in the ocean, you see. I'm not free of greed, hate and delusion. Who is?
Compassion was to feel with, doesn't it mean this?
Yes, it means that. It means that. But I think in many people's usage and sense, it's much too close to pity. It's much too close to... It's a sense of, develop compassion and you will be a higher being. Well, you're not a higher being. Forget the idea of being a higher being. It's just to me, it's just a sort of pretension to be a higher being. I'm not a higher being.
But the idea, because obviously this is crucial to your talk and crucial to the discussion of self-power and other power, which is there in all of the traditions.
Yeah.
But wouldn't you say then, of course, there is a transcendent, spirit is transcendent in the sense, I think, in which you're meaning it, but also something inside oneself, immanence, empathy, what you like, that arises in response to what is
Well, it may be so, but I don't have any real emphasis there. I'd much rather just trust the universe to do its own thing. If you see what I mean.
Yes, I'm quite interested in your experience. I mean, it's maybe a bit similar to what David said. When you talk about, I see the rock, and I see that I'm separate from the rock. What interests me in my life is maybe I see the rock and I see how do I feel when I'm with the rock. And I see a tree, how do I feel when I'm with the tree? Or I'm with you, how do I feel when I'm with you? And so I wonder I think that might be a bit what David's saying. I wonder how you experience then the different places or people.
No, differently on different occasions, just like anybody else. I mean, ups and downs.
Ups and downs. But to me, that indicates. I don't know. Just not sure whether it is actually the opposite of what you're saying.
Let me read you a passage from Pessoa. People know Pessoa? You should know Pessoa. Pessoa. Is anybody Portuguese here? We've got somebody Portuguese here, isn't there? Not in the room. Oh dear.
If she knew you were going to quote from Pessoa, I'm sure
She must be a mystery.
I'm going to quote from Pessoa. This is from the Book of Disquiet. Wonderful book. There are moments when every detail of the ordinary interests me in its own right, and I feel affectionate towards everything because I can read it all so clearly. Then, as Susa says, I perceive the singularity of the ordinary, and I am a poet with the kind of soul that amongst the Greeks produced the intellectual age of poetry. And Pessoa is generally acknowledged as the greatest Portuguese poet. So he was a poet, by external acclaim. He goes on. But there are also moments, like now, when I feel too oppressed and too aware of myself to be conscious of external things. And everything then becomes, for me, a night of rain and mud, alone and lost in an abandoned railway station where the last third-class train left hours ago and the next has yet to arrive. In common with all virtues, and indeed all vices, my inner virtue, my capacity for objectivity, that deflects me from thoughts of self, suffers from crises of confidence. Then I wonder at my ability to survive, at my cowardly presence here amongst these people on terms of perfect equality, in genuine accord with all their trite illusions. All the solutions spawned by my imagination flash upon my mind like beams from a distant lighthouse. Suicide, flight, renunciation, in short, the grand aristocratic gestures of our individuality. The cloak and dagger existences like mine with no balconies to climb. Balconies as in Romeo and Juliet. But the ideal Juliet of the finest reality has closed the high windows of literary discourse on the fictitious Romeo in my blood. She obeys her father, he obeys his. The feud between the Montagues and the Capulets continues. The curtain falls on what did not happen. And my office worker's collar turned unselfconsciously up around the neck of a poet. My boots, which I always buy in the same shop, instinctively skirting the puddles of cold rainwater, I return home, to that room where the absent mistress of the house is as sordid a reality as the rarely seen children and the office colleagues I will meet again tomorrow, feeling a slight, confused concern that I may have lost forever both my umbrella and the dignity of my soul. There aren't many readers I feel completely at home with, but writers. But Pessoa, I do find immensely accurate, if you like, about the human condition. And I suppose my sense has gradually been, after... Yes, I mean, that's it. My sense is that it's in the human condition, in this existential place, that some true meaning or dignity exists, not in an elevated state. Because the elevated states are all like that. He can be the poet, and then he gets out of bed on the wrong side. It's another day. Something else happens. It rains. A plan doesn't work out. And suddenly all the greed, hate, and delusion. The Buddha, I'll come to you in a second. The Buddha two things that I really like, two or three things. When you see the story of the Buddha's enlightenment, first thing, within hours of him becoming the Buddha, what is happening? Mara's armies are assaulting him. In other words, all the greed, hate, and delusion that we all have was as fully present for him as it had ever been. If anything, more so. It was not a case of having gradually ascended some ladder of stripping off this, stripping off that, stripping off the other, and getting to some elevated state from which he could step off into enlightenment. He was in the shit right at the end, at that point. Second thing, we all know the story, most of us know the story, of how the Buddha, his first thought on being enlightened was, nobody will understand this, there's no point in going forth. And he had to be persuaded by the Brahma god, Sahampati, to go forth. In other words, the first cogent thought of an enlightened Buddha was wrong. It was a mistake. Yes? So much for omniscience. And then the Buddha, telling his own story about the enlightenment, he does go forth and he meets a sadhu on the road. And the sadhu says, and who are you and what are you about? And he says, I'm the Buddha, I'm enlightened, I've understood everything. And the sadhu says, oh yes, well that may be so, and passes on his way. Right? Now, what is this? This is a story of somebody being arrogant, yes, and the sadhu taking it the way many people would take somebody being arrogant. And who told this story? The Buddha, retrospectively. So here you have the Buddha, some years, 20 years later, saying to his disciples, look what an arrogant sod I was. It's a story told against himself. You see? What picture of the Buddha does this give us? A very human person. Yeah. If he's achieved anything, it's not an eradication of his failings, it's an awareness of them. You had a question?
Yeah, I was just going to sort of say that you mentioned the Four Noble Truths, and basically, my understanding is that, yeah, it will be shitty, but you want to suffer unnecessarily.
Yeah, well, my interpretation of the Four Noble Truths is completely different, as you might expect. The Four Noble Truths, and I've written about it in a book called The Feeling Buddha. The Four Noble Truths are usually taken as meaning that suffering, dukkha, which is the first Noble Truth, is caused by craving and desire. You can eradicate this craving and desire by following what is called the Eightfold Path. And if you do so, then you will be beyond suffering. For all sorts of reasons, I think this doesn't hold water. the way I would interpret it, and we could go into more details, but it could take the whole hour, is that dukkha, which you can interpret as suffering or affliction, but you could quite interestingly take as spiritual danger. Literally it means a bad space. Yeah, it's that space we're in when, and he lists a whole load of things happen, like illness, disease, death, failure, loss, plans not working out, that sort of thing. When you're in that sort of spot, that's the first noble truth. The Buddha firstly says that's a noble truth. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's life. You see? That's the lot of us all. That's the position we're in. Yeah? Buddha's included. What happens then? Well, what happens then is the second noble truth, is that there is an arising of energy. We are galvanized in some way or other. And usually we pour that energy into things that just make more trouble. Yeah? We reach for the bottle, turn on the television, distract ourselves. If it's really bad, we distort our whole lifestyle in various ways. Yeah? That's your second noble truth, is the arising, the samudaya, what comes up with dukkha samudaya, what comes up with suffering. But there is an alternative. And the Buddha says that's a noble truth too. The arising itself is perfectly natural. To spend your whole life in spiritual disciplines trying to stop energy coming up when something bad happens is futile. Because you're built that way. And it's supposed to happen. You're supposed to have that energy. Yes? The crucial thing is what you do with it. And in the third noble truth, he offers an option. You don't have to pour it into attachment to things which will create more trouble. Yeah? We could discuss what that option is. But I would see the Eightfold Path not as the means to, but as the outcome from that. You see? If you deploy that energy that comes up from the trouble and suffering in life well, instead of letting it drive you into bad habits and trouble, then you will be on a spiritual path. Then you will find right thought, right outlook, right effort, a right lifestyle, and so on. Those things will come naturally out on. So my feeling is that many of the ways that Buddhism is commonly interpreted are kind of cart before the horse. Many of the things that are looked at as methods to achieve are actually outcomes. The Buddha did not get enlightened by following the Eightfold Path. He didn't know about the Eightfold Path until he was enlightened. It came to him as a fruit of enlightenment. It was not the means by which he got enlightened. You see? And no more will it be so for us. I was at a conference recently and somebody said, the Buddha achieved enlightenment by following a path of arduous practice. Not true. The Buddha became enlightened when he rejected the path of arduous practice. He'd been doing it for years. It was when he decided this is ignoble and useless. That's when he became enlightened. When he became an ordinary human being. You see? That's very different. It's very different. So, yes, I mean, there are different interpretations. And this is one. Yes?
You fundamentally saying that accepting being human is really essentially a spiritual path.
Yes. Yes. Accepting being human and all that brings, with all the expectation that you will fail in all sorts of ways, that you will be disappointed in all sorts of ways, that you will not rise. You may have glorious moments of spiritual insight and so on, but you will not stabilize them and remain like that indefinitely. The Buddha surprisingly said everything passes, mean, all those ecstasies pass as well. And it's like Jack Cornfield says, after the ecstasy, the laundry, you know. But it's not just that there are external jobs to do. It's how we are. We're like that, you know. And it's very freeing. That's right. That's right.
Is that to say that one shouldn't aspire to be better than one is, though?
Well, I think there's always a spiritual danger in doing so. You see, and this is where the self-power, other-power thing becomes quite significant and subtle in a way. Because if you think you can do it, it's an arrogance. You see?
So what you're saying, are you saying, that if you got a lot of faults, and as we all do, and then you do things that are wrong, say, oh well, and people say, oh well, that wasn't very kind, or that wasn't very, so, well, that's just how I am, and I'm not changing, and I've heard people say this, and I'm not changing for anyone. Now, is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying be honest. I mean, that's not a very honest thing to say.
What, if this is how I am and I'm not changing? If somebody said that?
You don't know if you're changing.
Yeah, but it's not dishonest, it's ignorant, isn't it?
Well, perhaps.
Which is different.
Yes, perhaps. But you don't know if you're changing, you see. I mean, what a lot of people want to do, people on spiritual paths, they want to take control of their changing. You can't. You see, you can't take control of it. It's that is ego. You see, it's
So you're saying there's no process, or the process is just the moment? I mean, what's the difference between you, who you are now, and the little boy in Cyprus who was looking at this?
Well, I mean, other than the obvious. I mean, so I'm now 6'1". You know, I mean, I've been through many experiences. I've been through many experiences of trying to take control of my spiritual development and destiny. You know, I've had years of intensive session practice in Zen monasteries. That's pretty tough. I'm still full of greed, hate, and delusion. Why aren't I enlightened? You know, why aren't I a fully realized being? I have followed the recipe. I've cooked the dish. I've done it all. You know, how many lifetimes? You know, when? When's it going to be?
Are you suggesting that the recipe book, as currently read, then
is corrupted?
Is inadequate, or has somehow been missed? And if that is the case, just following from your Ingrid's question, I asked you a number of very simplistic questions earlier on today. This is the most simplistic. Do we stop looking for the recipe book, sit aware of where and who we are, and watch its development with...
That sounds like a recipe book to me.
Well, okay. Then my second question is, the second part of the question is answered.
You know,
Yes.
I mean, the thing is, you know, when you say "do we," it's like you want a recipe book, and I mean the reality is you probably will keep looking for recipes. You know, that's a fact.
Would this be the point then, when you become more open to other power?
Well, you know that you're looking for recipes, but you need a sense of humour. I mean, what do you think you're doing? Do you really think you're going to be a Buddha?
Sorry, just try to put a point for dialogue, dialectic tension and such, really. What you say to me, you seem to try to link it back to the subject of this conference, which is a transpersonal one. And what you say, it seems to me, is also the artistic one, which relate to my hobby as well. Which it seems to me that the kind of human condition that you are painting from the lens of Zen and Buddhist perspective is a kind of human condition that is a human contradictions.
Yeah.
One has to hold and accept
There's a kind,
yes. Two directions.
There's a kind of built-in contradiction. Now, there's an irony. There's an irony in our existence, and we live with that irony, day in and day out.
But is that contradiction in Chinese terms, yin and yang, related to transpersonal language? Is the kind of dual or non-dual that we're holding at the same time simultaneously?
I don't know. I mean, maybe you can tell me. The Western tradition very much focuses on love, and the Eastern tradition, it seems to me, like if you're thinking what is a Buddha or what does Buddha-ness mean or something, focuses on unconditionality. And that notion of unconditional love is a kind of, in a sense, an overarching ideal. Now, I can't realize it. I don't have any unconditional love. I have bits of love, but conditions then come along, and then one suffers. And what does one do then? Maybe that suffering turns into valuable experience and gets properly digested, as it were, or maybe it doesn't. But along the way, one suffers.
But the love could still be there.
Well, it comes and goes, doesn't it? It's like Pessoa, I mean, one moment he's a great poet, and the next moment he's feeling rotten.
Yeah, but love doesn't always have to make you feel happy, does it?
No, that's right.
But the underlying
Yes.
love that one might have for humanity, for people, for another person, no matter how bad you feel, that love can still underlie everything.
Well, one can think that way and one can talk that way, but I think the notion of underlyingness is probably non-Buddhist. Because it implies an enduring something.
Yeah, I mean...
You see. I mean, experientially, phenomenologically, you can say things pop up, and perhaps repeatedly. And the Western tendency is then to say they were there all along during the periods when you weren't aware of them. And that's one way of mapping the mind. But it's only one way of mapping the mind, and I don't think it's the way the Buddha did.
But Jesus taught
There are other questions, but...
He did teach unconditional love.
Oh yes, unconditional love, I think, is certainly very important. Anthony?
I was just going to say, first of all, I wasn't quite sure whether you'd finished your talk, whether we'd gone into the question zone period.
Well, that's all right. I'm quite happy.
Did you want to continue your talk first?
No, I'm quite happy.
So we are going into the question.
I'll build on the questions.
Right,
Yeah.
it's just that I had a quick question. Carl Jung once said, a prime difference between Christianity and Buddhism
Yeah.
is that Christianity values suffering, whereas Buddhism takes a negative view of suffering. Now, although I can see the point Carl Jung is making,
Yeah.
I wondered whether you'd wish to challenge that view, that Buddhism takes a negative view towards suffering.
Well, my reading of it, which may be completely heretical, would suggest that, yes. Yes, the Buddha, what Buddha taught is a means of using the energy that comes out of our suffering, and so it would be a teaching that, suffering is suffering. I mean, suffering is intrinsically unpleasant, so it's not something you want to have lots of. So it's not saying suffering is a good thing, but suffering is a fact. Yes.
Say, well, we can actually learn from suffering because it's
Yes.
the first of the noble
Yes.
truths. And when
Yes.
we recognize suffering,
Yes.
that's when enlightenment begins.
Yes.
In that sense,
Yes.
you could say there was a limitation in what Jung was saying, in that you can see how,
Yes.
in some respects, Buddhism is actually looking at suffering in a more positive
Yes.
light than Jung really
Yes.
gave credit for.
Yes. That's right. There's a point over there.
What What is then illusion?
What is
What is
illusion?
illusion?
Illusion? Delusion? I mean, illusion is usually used to mean like perceiving things that aren't actually there. It's a kind of technical psychological term. Delusion usually means false ideas, false thinking, da-da-da-da-da-da. We all have illusions when we get a severe fever or something like that. It's a physical thing.
But that's one of the teachings of Buddhism.
Delusion, yes, we have delusion. We have delusions. Well, I would say that's more a Hindu idea, if I'm getting you right. You know, I'm not of the school of thought that thinks that none of you are really here, you're all just projections of my mind. And that I'm only seeing you because my karma happens to have fallen out that way. And if my karma were better, you'd all be something else. But I might be wrong, you know. I mean, it's one of those philosophical conundrums that there's no way of solving. But
obviously, one can't remain, if one has an exalted state, a mystical state, and this is very much the teaching in the Western tradition, you can't remain in that state. There were saints, of course,
yeah.
And there were mystics who
Yeah.
go into static.
That's right.
But then you can't live in
Well, you can't stay in it.
if you stay in that state.
That's right.
But it doesn't mean that the state itself doesn't have validity.
No, that's right. That's right.
And then the practice is, how can one put oneself in a sufficiently receptive frame of mind? In Christianity, it's often described as waiting upon the Lord.
Yes.
Trying to get away from all this rubbish which you've quite rightly been talking about, which is always present in the mind. It brings in very much what Rob was saying, that when all this settles down, then one finds what is there.
Well, perhaps, but you know, you can rely on it that it ain't going to settle down.
Even momentarily?
Oh, momentarily, yes.
Yeah. But it is those
Momentarily.
It is those hints and whispers, in a sense,
Yeah.
isn't it? When it does settle
That's
down.
right. That's right. And yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, and then I mean, in other models, you can talk about it like I think Les was talking about immanence and ultimacy occluding each other in the Kabbalah tradition. We're not living in ultimacy. So all the stuff that's written about ultimacy and so on, it may all be perfectly true, but we ain't there. You see, we're here in a relative world. This is what we live with, and so really, it does seem to me that a spiritual life is a life in which you live in this, in faith, because you know you can't have certainty here. It's not set up that way.
With Oscar Wilde, who said we're all of us living in the gutter, but someone's looking at the stars.
Well, that's interesting.
And experience, as Ingrid says, the reality also of love.
Yeah, there's a question.
I just wanted to ask you whether you thought that it's possible that in this process of our growth, because I think that, I don't know, but what you're leaving me with, and this might be my own misinterpretation of what you're saying, is almost like there is no hope, because we are in a constant state, whereas I would think, and this is based on my own experience, that you can start off having feelings of pain and suffering that do change as you go into the process and come out of it, and you go into it, and the circles widen. And in that widening of the circle, eventually you do face, let's say, the darkest point, which is the dark night of the soul, but one also has to realize that there is a way out of that, surely. And in the process of that, I don't know if one becomes enlightened. I don't want to use the word enlightened. And I don't think you only become aware, because slowly there's a transformation of the parts that we see as dark, the parts that are, they transform and become stronger. And surely that is the process of like climbing up a mountain. You do eventually get to some point. You don't stay
Well, it's the point of it may be the point of climbing up a mountain. What I'm saying is my model of spirituality is not a model of climbing up a mountain. You know, it's a matter of recognizing the nature of us, me, and the situation we're in, and seeing climbing mountains as a kind of arrogance.
David, I can't help hearing in this your disappointment.
You can't hear?
I can't help hearing in this your disappointment.
Yes? Yes? Yeah. Yes. Disappointment, yeah.
Can I help?
You know, but I suppose but there is something beyond the disappointment in a sense, because the inherence of disappointment in our situation itself seems to me to be the real dignity of our being, and to live in flight from that is not as noble.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the Buddha taught a noble way of life. He didn't teach an escape from suffering. He taught how to live a noble life in the midst of a world such as this. Now that's different.
Hi, David. I just want to continue the dialogue or the quest about the sense of hopelessness or disappointment or whatever that we tend to conclude on that. But I just want to throw in the pot of the dialogue optimistic challenge on the stage of belief, in the sense that go back to the beginning of your talk. You mentioned about the understanding of the stone, and also you mentioned about love in particular, unconditional love, and the contradiction seemed to me you quest about there are no hopes of understanding another being, object, or person's experience. For example, unconditional love, but may not be as a person as such, but our thought in terms of unconditional love, there's a universal human experience, such as the love of one's families, parents, and children. Those are the examples of unconditional love. There must be other examples as well, but these are the obvious ones. And although we may not be directly experience how we feel in terms of unconditional love, but we could draw the imagination about how oneself feels and draw upon the collective.
Well, it seems to me that the spiritual stance or the spiritual position is a feeling of being loved. It's a sense of gratitude. It's a sense of living in grace. That even though all our projects in this relative world are full of disappointments and frustrations, and even though from that frustration energy can come that we can in relative ways apply in all sorts of constructive projects, in all of that we're still loved. You see? And it's that sense of being loved that is spirituality, it seems to me, rather than something that, however inflated a conception you have of it, can be done by the ego. And whether you put it into a Buddhist frame or a Christian frame or a Muslim frame it doesn't really matter. It's that sense, however you conceptualize it, whatever map you use, of being loved, of being held in a state of being loved.
That's where you begin with grace.
Yes, that's right. And the whole thing is like that. And, love is about perceiving what is lovable in the other. And having that persist in some way. For all that, we are inconstant beings. But the persistence of seeing something lovable in the other. And recognizing the otherness of the other, which in some ways is like the ultimate degree of it. And so the sense of love as a union, well, it's one way of looking at things, but I don't think it's the most helpful. To love somebody unconditionally is to recognize their otherness, is to recognize that they do what they do for their reasons, not as some extension of me, not as some useful utility to me, not as a function of me, not in spite of me. They do what they do for their reasons. They are what they are for their reasons. That's unconditionality. And that means recognizing that the other is other. And that's love, you see. And I think that's one of the main points I want to get across, it's not just the sense of like a sort of transpersonal or cosmic other, though that's important, but the sense of just otherness every day, in our relations with one another. What is other, recognizing the otherness of the other is a crucial element in being spiritually mature, it seems to me. And that's what we call love. And that was what was in the poem, of course, that to love is to love what you are not. We're running out of time, aren't we?
Running out of time, and we don't need a question time, do we? We've had it built in. Do you want to wind up?
Well, I've enjoyed having the dialogue, and
Was the writing was a conclusion?
yeah.
So
Am I still anxious? Yes, I am a bit, actually. I'm not sure why, but yes, there we are. These things come and go.
I find your words impeccably on the mark for me personally. I've come to believe that grieving and gratitude are two of the most important of the 5 or 6 spiritual disciplines I've practiced. And I know I'm married 45 years to a woman who, at some level, I know I'll never know. She'll never know me.
Yes.
And that my children, I read at times that my children and my grandchildren, I will never know.
Yes.
They will never know me.
Well, the subject that I haven't touched on, but that you've just touched on, is the subject of grief. And this, of course, is also a very important dimension of all this. If you take, in a simplistic way, if you take Buddhism to be a getting rid of suffering, that means no grieving. Well, I think it's just downright unhealthy.
I heard you translate the dukkha as an issue of the fact that we cannot intentionally surrender. The surrender comes as almost a gift in which then we are able to say, thanks to life as it is given to me.
And you will be loved whether you surrender or not.
Yes. Thank God.
Namo Amida Butsu.